When Big Shaq is accused of trespassing on his own property, a routine day turns into a battle for justice. As sirens wail and cameras roll, the truth unfolds. But will it be enough to change the system? One mistake, one moment, one fight that shocks the nation. And this time, the whole world is watching. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us, where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. The morning sun spilled golden light over the golden plate, its sleek glass windows gleaming against the backdrop of the bustling city. Inside, the scent of fresh coffee, buttered toast, and sizzling steak drifted through the air as the restaurant prepared for another packed day. The clinking of silverware, the soft hum of conversation, and the occasional burst of laughter created an atmosphere that was both refined and inviting. Behind the main counter, Big Shaq stood tall, literally and figuratively, a towering presence not just in stature but in influence. At 7 feet 1 inch, he could easily command attention in any room. But it wasn't just his size that made people respect him. It was the way he treated everyone, with warmth, kindness, and genuine care. He wasn't just a businessman. He was a mentor, a friend, and a protector of those who needed one. "Morning, boss." Sloan, the sharp-witted, fiercely independent waitress, greeted him as she adjusted her apron. She was in her mid-20s, with piercing green eyes and a determination that often made people underestimate her. She had dreams bigger than this restaurant, dreams of investigative journalism, of uncovering the truth, of changing the world one story at a time. But for now, the golden plate was home. Shaq grinned. "Morning, Sloan. You ready for another day of making sure I don't mess up my own restaurant?" She smirked. "That's what you pay me for." Across the room, Jackson, Shaq's childhood best friend, and now a well-respected lawyer, leaned back in a booth, sipping his coffee. "You know, it still blows my mind that we used to hustle for gas money back in the day, and now you own one of the top restaurants in the city." Shaq chuckled. "Man, don't remind me. We came a long way." Jackson nodded, his expression turning serious for a moment. "And that's why people don't like it, Shaq. A black man running a business this successful, in this part of town? Some folks are just waiting for you to slip." Shaq exhaled, leaning against the counter. He knew Jackson was right. Success hadn't erased the obstacles. It had just made them more subtle. The stares he got when he walked into high-end stores. The way some people hesitated when they realized he was the owner of the golden plate. The unspoken tension that never quite disappeared. But Shaq had never been one to back down. "I'm not slipping," he said firmly, "and I'm not going anywhere." Just then, the door swung open, and Devin, a retired firefighter and longtime friend, strolled in. The man had stories that could fill a book, and a presence that made people listen. "What's up, big man?" Devin greeted, slapping Shaq on the shoulder. "Heard some fancy critics coming in today. You nervous?" Shaq snorted. "Nervous? Please. I'd be more nervous if Sloan quit." Sloan smirked as she set down a fresh cup of coffee in front of Devin. "You should be. This place would fall apart without me." Laughter rippled through the restaurant, but in the back of Shaq's mind, Jackson's words lingered. "Some folks are just waiting for you to slip." As the lunch rush approached, Shaq stepped outside for a breather. The city had changed over the years, new developments, new businesses, but some things never changed. A few storefronts down, a group of men in suits laughed loudly as they exited a luxury tailor shop. They didn't acknowledge Shaq, but he could feel their glances, the way they sized him up before moving along. He had learned to ignore it. He had built something real, something no one could take away from him. A soft voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Excuse me, sir?" Shaq turned to see an older man, homeless, weathered, and frail, standing near the curb. His clothes were torn, his hands trembling slightly as he held out a small cup. Shaq reached into his pocket, pulling out a crisp $100 bill. "Get yourself a meal, all right?" The man's eyes widened. "God bless you." Before Shaq could respond, he felt it, the unmistakable weight of a stare. Across the street, Officer Matt Reynolds sat in his squad car watching. Shaq met his gaze, unflinching. Matt didn't move. He didn't need to. The message was clear. Shaq exhaled slowly, then turned back toward his restaurant, his jaw tightening. He had seen men like Matt before, and he had a feeling this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. Back inside, business was booming. Tables were packed, waitstaff moved with urgency, and the kitchen hummed with efficiency. The critic had arrived, some food blogger with a huge following, and Shaq made sure everything was flawless. "Table 12 looks impressed," Jackson observed from the bar. Shaq smirked. "That's the plan." Sloan suddenly appeared at his side, her expression unreadable. "You got a problem outside." Shaq followed her gaze toward the front window. Across the street, Officer Matt Reynolds had stepped out of his squad car. He wasn't alone. Another officer stood beside him, both staring directly at the golden plate. Shaq's stomach tightened. He wasn't the type to assume trouble. He wasn't the type to react without cause. But he just knew, that today wasn't going to end the way it started. And he had no idea just how right he was. Outside, Big Shaq stood near the entrance, hands in his pockets, taking in the rhythm of his business. Despite his wealth, despite his success, he never detached himself from the ground. He liked to see things up close, the way the customers reacted to their food, how his staff moved, how the community felt around his space. This wasn't just a restaurant to him, it was something bigger. A few feet away, an elderly man shuffled past, muttering to himself, his clothes tattered, his eyes sunken with hunger. Shaq had seen him before, lingering near the alleyways, always keeping his head down like the world had forgotten him. Without hesitation, Shaq reached into his wallet and handed him a crisp $100 bill. "Get something good to eat," Shaq said. The man blinked, as if the money wasn't real, then took it with trembling hands. "God bless you." Shaq gave him a nod before glancing across the street. And that's when he saw him. The cop leaned against his squad car, arms crossed, eyes locked onto Shaq with an expression that sent a clear message. He wasn't just looking, he was watching, analyzing, calculating. Shaq didn't flinch. He had dealt with men like Matt before, the kind who needed to remind people who had the power. Reynolds was new in town, but his reputation had moved faster than him. Word had already spread about his aggressive stops, his disproportionate targeting of black men, his tendency to see crime where there was none. And now, here he was, eyes narrowing, watching Shaq hand money to a homeless man like it was some kind of suspicious transaction. Shaq exhaled and turned away. He wasn't going to feed into whatever game this cop was playing, but he could feel it in his gut. This wasn't the last time their paths would cross. Matt Reynolds tapped his fingers against his badge, watching Shaq disappear into his restaurant. He had heard about him before he even set foot in this city. Big shot ex-athlete, millionaire businessman, man of the people. It didn't sit right with Matt. In his world, men like Shaq were supposed to be on the other side of success, the kind he was used to seeing in mugshots, not on the covers of magazines. Matt had transferred to this city for a reason. His last precinct had been too soft, too many eyes watching, too many complaints piling up. Here, he had the chance to re-establish himself, to remind people that respect for authority wasn't optional. And what better way to do that than to remind a man like Shaq where he really stood? He adjusted his belt and muttered under his breath, "We'll see how long that throne lasts." Back inside, Shaq settled into his usual rhythm, making rounds, checking in with the staff, ensuring every dish met his standards. But the tension from outside lingered. He could feel it in his bones, like an unease that refused to fade. Near the bar, Jackson sipped his drink, watching Shaq with a knowing look. "You good?" Shaq exhaled through his nose. "Yeah." Jackson didn't buy it. "Let me guess, that new cop?" Shaq didn't answer immediately. He picked up a napkin, folding it between his fingers, before finally saying, "He was watching me like I stole something." Jackson leaned forward, voice low. "You already know how this goes. You don't fit into their version of how things should be. That makes you a problem." Shaq met his friend's gaze. He had known Jackson since they were kids, back when they had nothing, when every dollar had to be stretched, when every corner store owner watched them like they were waiting for them to steal. Some things changed. Some things didn't. But Shaq wasn't a kid anymore, and he damn sure wasn't going to let a man like Matt Reynolds push him back into the box society had built for him. Across the street, Matt still hadn't left. He leaned against his car, scanning the restaurant, his fingers twitching at his holster. Then, without warning, he made his move. He pushed off the squad car, adjusted his uniform, and strode toward the golden plate. Inside, Sloan had just finished refilling a customer's drink when she caught sight of the cop heading toward the entrance. Her stomach tensed. "Shaq," she said under her breath. "You've got company." Shaq turned just as the restaurant door swung open. Matt stepped inside, the shift in energy immediate. Conversations dipped. Forks clinked softly against plates. Shaq squared his shoulders, stepping forward. "Officer, something I can help you with?" Matt's lips curled slightly. Not quite a smile. Not quite a smirk. "Just checking out the place. Never been here before." Shaq nodded slowly. "Well, you're welcome to grab a table. Best food in the city." Matt let his gaze sweep over the room, then back to Shaq. "You own this place?" Jackson, still seated at the bar, let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. Sloan folded her arms. Devon, standing near the back, subtly edged closer. Shaq met Matt's stare evenly. "That a problem?" Matt's smirk remained. "Just unexpected." Shaq felt something tighten in his chest. He had heard that word before. Unexpected, like success wasn't supposed to belong to him. He kept his voice steady. "Well, now you know. You want a menu?" Matt ignored the question. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a notepad. "How about I ask you a few questions instead?" Sloan tensed. Jackson put down his drink. Devon's jaw twitched. Shaq didn't blink. "Questions about what?" Matt tapped his pen against the pad. "Oh, just routine stuff, like say, what exactly were you doing outside earlier?" A slow silence settled over the restaurant. Shaq tilted his head. "Excuse me?" Matt kept his stance relaxed, but his tone sharpened just slightly. "Saw you hand off some cash to a man, just making sure everything's legit." Jackson exhaled sharply, muttering under his breath. Sloan's fingers tightened into fists. Devon took a step forward before catching himself. Shaq, however, stayed still, controlled, unshaken. "That was a homeless man," Shaq said simply. "I gave him money for food." Matt nodded, as if he was taking this in, then let out a soft, Shaq folded his arms. "That gonna be a problem, officer?" Matt tilted his head as if considering. Then, after a beat, he smirked. "Nah, just doing my job." And with that, he tucked his notepad away, gave a slow glance around the restaurant, and turned for the door. As he stepped out, he tossed one last look over his shoulder. "I'll be seeing you around." The door swung shut. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Jackson let out a low, frustrated exhale. "That's not the last time he's showing up here." Shaq didn't answer. He didn't have to. He already knew. And something told him the next time wouldn't be as casual. The hum of traffic mixed with the occasional shout from street vendors. Shaq stepped onto the sidewalk for a moment of fresh air, stretching his massive frame as he surveyed the street. That's when he saw him again. The same homeless man from earlier, sitting on the curb, his shoulders hunched, his face worn with the weight of a life that had never been kind to him. Shaq reached into his pocket, pulled out another $100 bill, and walked toward him. "Hey, man," he said, his voice steady but kind. "Did you get something to eat?" The man looked up, eyes filled with surprise. He held up a half-eaten sandwich like proof. "Yeah," he said. "Got this. Been a long time since I had a meal like that." Shaq nodded, extending the bill. "Here, make sure you get something for later, too." The man hesitated for only a second before taking the money with trembling hands. His lips parted, but before he could thank Shaq, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Sir, step away from the property." Shaq turned. Officer Matt Reynolds was already crossing the street, his uniform crisp, his jaw tight, eyes locked onto Shaq like a hunter spotting prey. Shaq's brow furrowed. "Excuse me?" Matt's stride was purposeful, his hand resting on his belt as he closed the distance. "I said step away." Shaq didn't move. "I don't know what you think is happening here, officer, but I'm just helping someone in need." Matt's gaze flicked toward the homeless man, then back to Shaq. "Is that what we're calling it now?" A slow tension began to rise in Shaq's chest. His fists clenched at his sides, but his voice remained controlled. "What exactly do you think is happening?" Matt exhaled, shaking his head like Shaq had just said something foolish. "I saw you hand off cash. You think I don't recognize a transaction when I see one?" Shaq's breath caught in his throat. He had known this was coming. Maybe not today, maybe not like this, but it had been building since the first time Matt laid eyes on him. The officer took another step closer, now just a few feet away, and squared his shoulders. "This is private property. I'm going to need you to step back," Matt ordered, his voice cool but firm. Shaq let out a slow, measured breath. Stay calm. That's what his mother always told him. That's what his father drilled into him as a kid. Because men like him didn't get second chances in situations like these. "I own this place," Shaq said evenly. Matt's eyes flickered, just for a second. Like he didn't quite process what Shaq had just said. Like he had already decided the narrative in his head, and this didn't fit. The pause was brief, but the damage was already done. A few passers-by had slowed their steps. A couple sitting on the restaurant patio had stopped eating, their eyes darting between Shaq and the officer. A cook inside peeked through the kitchen window, his movements suddenly stilled. The tension was palpable. Matt scoffed. "You expect me to believe that?" Shaq stared at him. His pulse was steady, but the anger beneath it burned hotter by the second. "You're standing in front of my restaurant," Shaq said, his voice unwavering. "You can read the damn sign on the door." Matt's jaw tightened. He glanced toward the Golden Plate's entrance, as if just now acknowledging the sleek logo on the glass. Shaquille O'Neal, owner. For a fraction of a second, Matt faltered. But then, instead of backing down, he doubled down. "Let's see some ID," he said. Shaq exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Man, you're kidding me." Matt's stance remained rigid. Not a joke. Shaq didn't move. And now, the crowd was growing. Jackson had stepped outside, his lawyer instincts kicking in as he assessed the situation. Sloan was behind him, eyes sharp, hands gripping her phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. Devin had moved closer, standing just inside the doorway, his expression dark. Someone whispered, "What's going on?" Another voice. That's Big Shaq." Phones were coming out. Screens lit up. Cameras started rolling. People knew what this looked like. Matt noticed. And for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty flashed in his eyes. But he didn't back down. "This is a simple request," Matt said, though there was nothing simple about it. "You show me ID, and we're done here." Shaq didn't move. He could feel every set of eyes on him. The weight of the moment, the unfairness, the sheer audacity of being treated like an intruder in his own success. And yet, he knew exactly how this could go. He knew that if he refused, Matt would push harder. He knew if he raised his voice, the situation could escalate in ways he couldn't control. He had seen this play out too many times. Slowly, Shaq reached into his pocket. He pulled out his wallet, flipped it open, and handed over his driver's license. Matt took it, staring at the name, the face. Shaquille O'Neal. There was no mistaking it now. No way to pretend he didn't know exactly who he had just confronted. The energy in the air shifted. Matt was silent for a beat too long, his fingers tightening around the card before finally handing it back. "Enjoy your afternoon," he muttered, then turned on his heel and strode back toward his squad car. The moment he was gone, the floodgates burst open. "That was some straight-up bull," Jackson started, but Shaq held up a hand, cutting him off. Sloan was already shaking her head, eyes flashing. "This isn't over, not by a long shot." Shaq pocketed his ID, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off the tension. He wasn't going to let this moment define him. Not today. Not ever. But deep down, he knew the truth. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The street outside the Golden Plate was no longer just another city sidewalk. It had become a stage, a place where power and pride clashed under the unforgiving heat of the afternoon sun. Shaq stood his ground, his massive frame towering over Officer Matt Reynolds, who now had his hand resting on his holster. The restaurant's golden logo glimmered on the glass behind Shaq, a clear statement of who he was and what he had built. Yet, despite the undeniable truth, Matt still looked at him like he didn't belong. "Show me your ID," Matt repeated, his tone sharper this time. Shaq clenched his jaw. He had already given it once. He wasn't about to do it again. "I already told you," Shaq said, his voice even. "I own this place." Matt's nostrils flared. His fingers twitched at his belt. "And I told you. I need to confirm that." A small crowd had formed on the sidewalk, their whispers weaving together like static. Inside, Jackson, Devin, and Sloan were watching through the windows. The tension had shifted from uneasy to electric. Sloan was the first to move. She pushed past Jackson and stormed outside, her apron still tied around her waist, her phone already recording. "This is ridiculous," she said, stepping between Shaq and Matt. "You know exactly who he is." Matt barely glanced at her. "This is none of your concern, miss." "Oh, it's very much my concern," she shot back. "You're harassing my boss outside of his own restaurant." Devin joined her, his voice measured but firm. "Officer, what exactly are you trying to accomplish here?" Matt ignored them both. His gaze never left Shaq. "You're obstructing an investigation," Matt said. "Last warning, show me your ID." Shaq exhaled slowly, his fists tightening at his sides. "I know my rights," he said. "And I know this ain't about ID." Shaq exhaled slowly, his fists tightening at his sides. "I know my rights," he said. "And I know this ain't about ID. It's about you flexing your power." Matt's jaw tensed, his stance shifting slightly forward. "Is that right?" Shaq held his ground. "That's right." Jackson had heard enough. He strode out of the restaurant, his suit crisp, his eyes sharp with authority. He stepped right between Shaq and Matt, lifting his hands in an almost casual way. But every movement was calculated. "Officer," Jackson said smoothly, "I'm Shaquille O'Neal's attorney. If you'd like to continue this conversation, you can do so with me." Matt didn't flinch. "I'm talking to him, not you." Jackson smirked. "Yeah, I noticed. That's why I'm here." More people had gathered now, some pulling out their phones. A few whispered among themselves. Others just watched, waiting to see how far this would go. Matt's eyes flicked to the growing crowd. His grip on control was slipping. Then, he did exactly what Shaq knew he would do. He reached for his radio. "This is Officer Reynolds. Need immediate backup at my location," Matt said, his voice calm, controlled. But the damage was already done. The moment the words left his mouth, the energy in the air shifted. Shaq heard Devin curse under his breath. Sloan stiffened. Jackson's smirk vanished. And Shaq? He knew what was coming. It started as a distant hum. Then, it became unmistakable. Sirens. The crowd's murmurs turned into full-blown conversation. A few people stepped back, shaking their heads. They had seen this before. Shaq let out a slow breath. He had spent years controlling his emotions, choosing silence over rage, but right now, it was getting harder. Matt stood firm, his expression unreadable, but Shaq could feel it, the quiet satisfaction beneath the surface. This was exactly what Matt wanted. The first squad car arrived, its tires screeching slightly as it pulled to a stop. 2 officers stepped out, eyes darting between Shaq and Matt. "Everything all right here?" one of them asked. Matt didn't hesitate. "I was investigating a possible criminal act. This man refused to show ID." Shaq closed his eyes for half a second. There it was, the false narrative. The thing men like Matt always did. Devin stepped forward, his voice tightly controlled. "That's not what happened, officer." Sloan turned her phone toward the officers. "We've got it all on video. You want to try that again?" The second officer glanced at the growing crowd, then at Matt. His expression shifted slightly, like he wasn't buying it. Then something unexpected happened. A third officer stepped out of another arriving squad car. A senior officer. And the second his eyes landed on Shaq, his whole face changed. "Hold up," the senior officer said, his brows furrowing. "That's Shaquille O'Neal." The moment the words left his mouth, the weight in the air shifted again. Matt's shoulders squared, His jaw twitched, but he didn't speak. The senior officer stepped forward, scanning the scene, the crowd, the restaurant, the tension. Then he looked at Matt. "Reynolds, what the hell is going on?" Matt's face barely moved. "I was conducting an investigation." The senior officer's eyes flicked to Shaq, reading the situation instantly. "Shaq," he said, his tone different now, like he was trying to undo something already done. "Are you all right?" Shaq let out a slow breath. "I was," he said simply. The crowd reacted to that. A few murmurs, a few nods. The senior officer understood. He turned back to Matt. "You need to let this go." Matt's mouth opened, then shut. His fingers twitched at his belt. He didn't want to back down. But now, he had no choice. Finally, after a long, unbearable pause, Matt exhaled sharply and took a step back. "No issue here," he muttered. The crowd wasn't satisfied. Someone called out, "Yeah, that's what I thought." Another voice, "We got all this on video." Shaq didn't move. He just watched as Matt swallowed his pride, turned, and walked back toward his car. It wasn't a victory, not really, but it wasn't a loss either. The crowd slowly began to break apart. Some stayed to talk, shaking their heads, muttering under their breaths. Others just left, probably carrying the story with them, ready to tell it at dinner tables and barbershops. Jackson sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. That was too damn close. Sloan was still recording. She hadn't lowered her phone once. Devin crossed his arms. "You all right?" Shaq didn't answer immediately. He just stared at the squad cars as they pulled away, the sirens no longer blaring but still lingering in his head. Then finally, he spoke. "This isn't over." Sloan's grip tightened around her phone. "No," she said quietly. "It's not." Because they all knew the truth. Matt wasn't done. And the next time, it might not end this way. Matt Reynolds stood stiff, his jaw clenched so tight that the muscle twitched along his cheek. His grip on control was slipping, and he knew it. The senior officer who had just arrived, a man with salt and pepper hair and a weary but authoritative presence, kept his gaze locked on Matt, his expression unreadable. And then, in a voice that carried through the thick summer air, he said it. "You just messed up, big time." The words landed like a hammer. The tension that had been slowly simmering finally boiled over. Matt flinched. It wasn't obvious, but it was there. The slight shift in his stance, the brief flash of uncertainty in his eyes. He opened his mouth, but no words came. The crowd wasn't frozen anymore. They reacted instantly. A woman near the front gasped. A man in the back let out a low, satisfied "damn." Someone else muttered, "Yeah, that's what I thought." A younger guy in a hoodie had his phone pointed directly at Matt, recording every second of his unraveling. And just like that, the power dynamic flipped. The predator had become prey. The senior officer, whose name tag read Captain Eric Langley, stepped forward, his eyes scanning the scene with a mix of disappointment and controlled anger. "You called in backup," Langley said, his voice level but firm. "For what, exactly?" Matt finally found his voice. "He refused to show ID," he said, his words clipped. Langley turned to Shaq, then back to Matt. His expression darkened. "Because he owns this place," Langley said flatly. Matt's mouth pressed into a thin line. He knew he was cornered. "Reynolds," Langley continued, his tone quieter now but just as sharp. "You got a badge, you got a gun, but that doesn't mean you get to harass people just because you feel like it." The crowd reacted again. A ripple of murmurs, a few quiet laughs, and the unmissable sound of someone typing furiously on their phone. Matt's face wasn't just red, it was burning. He had never been talked down to like this. Not in front of people. Not like he was some rookie being scolded. He knew his career could survive a lot of things. But this was humiliation. If there had been any doubt that this was going to spread like wildfire, it was erased the second Sloan spoke up. "Just so we're clear," she called out, "we've got this whole thing recorded." Matt's eyes snapped to her. He hadn't even noticed her standing there, phone raised, the red recording light blinking in the corner of the screen. "And it's already uploaded," she added. If looks could kill, Sloan would have been on the ground. Matt's nostrils flared, but he said nothing. He knew. He knew. By the time he got back to his squad car, his face would be on 100 different Instagram accounts. By the time he got home, there'd be a hashtag with his name on it. By the time the morning news rolled in, his entire career could be on the line. The world was watching now, and the world never blinks. With the squad cars still idling in the background, Shaq exhaled and turned to the crowd. This moment? It wasn't about one cop and one black man. It was about every moment like this before it. He scanned the faces in the crowd. People he knew, people he didn't. Some looked angry, some looked tired. Some just looked like they had seen this too many times before. Shaq's voice was steady, but the weight behind it was undeniable. This isn't just about me, he said. This is about all of us. Someone in the crowd called out, "Say that again." Shaq met their gaze. This isn't just about me, he repeated, his voice carrying over the street. It's about every time somebody gets judged before they even open their mouth. It's about every time a black man gets asked to prove he belongs somewhere he already earned his right to be. A woman near the front wiped her eyes. A man in a business suit nodded. Shaq continued, "We talk about progress, about how things are different now, but then stuff like this happens, and it's a reminder that for some people, success doesn't erase suspicion, that no matter how hard we work, how much we give back, how much we build, some folks will still look at us and see a problem." The crowd was silent now, not because they weren't listening, but because they were absorbing. Shaq let out a slow breath. "I'm not going to let this moment be wasted. Not for me, not for anybody watching." A pause. Then someone started clapping, then another, until the entire street was filled with applause. Within minutes, the footage had hit Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. Within hours, it had racked up millions of views. Sloan sat in the back of the restaurant, her phone exploding with notifications. Every time she refreshed the page, the numbers climbed. 150,000 views, 260,000, 500,000. She clicked on the comments. Real Talk 1987. The way that cop's face changed when his boss called him out. Priceless. Justice for Shaq at Melinda K. Shaquille O'Neal shouldn't have to prove who he is to anyone. This is disgusting. West Coast Kev. I need that lawyer's name. Bro stepped up like a king. We see you. Jackson. Sloan leaned back, letting out a slow, disbelieving laugh. This is insane, she muttered. Jackson, who had been reading over her shoulder, smirked. That's an understatement. Devin folded his arms. We knew this would happen. The question is, what now? Shaq, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. We keep going, he said. This can't just be a viral moment. It has to be more. Jackson nodded. Then we make it more. Sloan smirked. Oh, trust me. The world's listening now. While the golden plate was buzzing with energy, Matt Reynolds sat in his squad car, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. His phone buzzed. He didn't have to check to know what it was. He already knew. He had lost. The world had already decided, and there was nothing he could do about it. That night, the city still pulsed with life. But something felt different. At the golden plate, customers poured in, not just for the food, but for the message. At police headquarters, Matt Reynolds sat in a closed-door meeting with his superiors. And on millions of screens across the country, Shaq's words played on repeat. This isn't just about me. It's about all of us. The world had watched, and now it was waiting for what happened next. The city felt different. It had only been 24 hours since the incident outside the Golden Plate, but the ripple effect was everywhere. Conversations in coffee shops, debates on talk shows, and an endless stream of opinions flooding social media. Some called it a wake-up call, others called it an overreaction. But one thing was clear. No one was ignoring it. At the center of it all was Big Shaq. His name wasn't just trending, it was everywhere. Not everyone saw the viral footage the same way. Some people, especially those who had been waiting for a reason to attack Shaq, used the moment to twist the narrative. Justice for cops. He refused to show ID. That's suspicious behavior. Why didn't he just comply? I'm blue line strong. Matt Reynolds was just doing his job. Another case of the media twisting things to fit an agenda. Alice Real American 78. Why is this even a big deal? He's rich. He's not oppressed. Shaq had seen enough of these arguments before. They weren't new, just louder now. But the support? That was louder too. Black excellence. Shaquille O'Neal built something amazing, and they still tried to humiliate him. This is why we talk about systemic racism. We see you, Shaq. If this can happen to him, imagine what happens to regular folks every day. Truth matters. Matt Reynolds had complaints before this, and nobody listened. Time for accountability. The battle lines had been drawn. The city was divided. And Shaq? He refused to stay silent. Sitting in his office at the Golden Plate, Shaq scrolled through his phone, taking in every comment, every news article, every opinion. He knew how this worked. He had spent years in the spotlight, on the court, on TV, and business. Public perception could make or break you. But this time, it wasn't just about him. It was about the bigger picture. He leaned forward, opening his Instagram live and pressing record. His face was calm but serious. His voice was steady but firm. I appreciate everyone who's been supporting me, he began. But this isn't just about me. This is about the fact that no matter how much you achieve, no matter how much you give back, some people will always see you as a threat first. He let the words sink in before continuing. I could have been anyone. And that's the problem. Within minutes, his live video exploded. News outlets picked up the clip. Celebrities shared it. More people joined the conversation. The city wasn't just watching anymore. It was waiting to see what would happen next. While the world debated, Matt Reynolds was fighting to save his career. Inside the police department, he sat across from Captain Eric Langley, arms crossed, jaw tight. The older officer stared at him, his fingers tapping against a file labeled Reynolds, M. Do you have any idea what kind of mess you just created? Langley asked, his voice flat. Matt didn't respond. Langley sighed, tossing the file onto the desk. We got pressure from the mayor's office. The department's getting calls nonstop, and half the city thinks we're out here harassing business owners for no reason. Matt finally spoke. I was doing my job. Langley's gaze hardened. Number you were making a point, and now you're the one paying for it. Matt opened his mouth, but Langley raised a hand. You're suspended. Indefinitely. Matt froze. Langley didn't blink. You're lucky it's not worse. The words hit Matt like a gut punch. He had expected backlash, but not this. Not like this. While Shaq was speaking out and Matt was scrambling to protect himself, Sloan was searching for the truth. Something about Matt Reynolds didn't sit right with her. It wasn't just that he had targeted Shaq. It was the way he did it. The arrogance, the control, the absolute certainty that he could get away with it. She started digging. Old complaints, internal reviews, suspensions. What she found shocked her. Matt Reynolds had a history, excessive force complaints, multiple reports of racial profiling, cases that had mysteriously disappeared from official records. She stared at the screen, her heart pounding. He wasn't just a bad cop, he was a protected one. Sloan grabbed her phone and dialed Jackson. You're gonna want to see this, she said. Because this wasn't just about one incident. This was so much bigger. The night had settled over the city, but inside the Golden Plate, the lights still burned bright. In the back office, Sloan sat hunched over her laptop, her fingers moving with quick, precise keystrokes as she scrolled through pages of documents, old case files, and news articles. Her heart pounded. She had been digging into Matt Reynolds for hours, searching for something, anything, that explained why he was so sure he could get away with what he did. And now? Now she had more than she ever expected. Jackson stood behind her, arms crossed, his sharp eyes scanning the screen. The more he read, the deeper his frown became. 3 excessive force complaints, Sloan muttered, clicking through the files. 2 for racial profiling, 1 for intimidation. Jackson leaned in. And not a single one resulted in disciplinary action. Not officially, Sloan said, pulling up another file. They were all resolved internally. No charges, no suspensions, just gone. Jackson exhaled sharply. That's not a coincidence. That's a cover-up. Sloan nodded, clicking to another page. And guess what? Every single one of those cases involved a black man. Different situations, different circumstances, but always the same pattern. Jackson's jaw tightened. He's been doing this for years. Sloan's hands clenched into fists, and getting away with it. A sick feeling twisted in her gut. Matt Reynolds wasn't just a racist cop who had a bad day. He was a dangerous man who had been protected for too long. Jackson ran a hand over his face. Okay, this is bad, but if we don't have solid proof, it's just speculation. Sloan smirked. You think I'd bring you half a story? She pulled up a file from a former officer's testimony, someone who had worked with Matt years ago before mysteriously leaving the force. Look at this, she said, tapping the screen. This guy, Officer Daniel Whitaker, filed a report about Matt using intimidation tactics during traffic stops. Said he saw him targeting young black men without just cause. Jackson's brows lifted. And, Sloan said, scrolling further. Whitaker transferred out of the department 3 months later. No reason given, just packed up and left. Jackson let out a low whistle. They pushed him out. Sloan nodded. Looks like it. And if they buried his report, they probably buried others too. Jackson stared at the screen, his lawyer instincts kicking in. We need to bring this to light, he said. If people see the full picture, Matt won't just lose his job. He'll lose his entire defense. Sloan smirked. I was hoping you'd say that. She reached for her phone. Time to leak the truth. The first post was subtle, just a tweet. Our Sloan right. Some cops have a pattern. You just have to look deep enough. Matt Reynolds. Within minutes, the internet took the bait. Replies flooded in. Alice Truth Seeker. Wait, what are you saying? Expose corruption. What do you know? Drop the files. We see you. Don't play with us, Sloan. If you've got something, show it. Sloan let them wait. She knew the game. She needed the right moment. A few hours later, she dropped the bombshell. As Sloan right. Since people want receipts, here's a thread, a history of Matt Reynolds. The first post was a timeline of Matt's complaints and misconduct cases. The second post? Screenshots of internal reports that never saw the light of day. The third? Testimony from Officer Daniel Whitaker. The internet erupted. Justice matters. This is why we don't trust cops like Matt Reynolds. As truth hurts. They protected him. The system protected him. Exposed. His whole career is a fraud. Within an hour, Matt Reynolds exposed was trending. By the next morning, his career was over. At police headquarters, Matt sat in a dimly lit office, staring at his phone. The screen was flooded with articles, posts, news segments, all dissecting his past. He had expected backlash. But this was a massacre. The department had already issued a statement distancing itself from him. His superiors weren't answering his calls. And when he checked his email, his lawyer had dropped him. Matt clenched his jaw. His life was collapsing in real time, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Back at the Golden Plate, Shaq watched the coverage unfold. The news anchors, the tweets, the fallout. Jackson stood next to him, arms crossed. We did it. Sloan leaned back in her chair, satisfied. Took long enough. Devon exhaled, but it still doesn't feel like enough. Shaq nodded. Because it's not. Matt might have fallen, but the system that protected him, that was still standing. Shaq wasn't done. Not yet. The storm had passed, but the echoes remained. It had been a week since the truth about Matt Reynolds surfaced. A week since his pattern of racial profiling, intimidation, and abuse of power had been exposed for the world to see. His name was everywhere, not as a law enforcer, but as a cautionary tale. The final blow came in the form of an official statement from the police department. Effective immediately, Officer Matt Reynolds has been terminated from duty. The department does not condone misconduct or any actions that violate public trust. A neatly crafted corporate response. No apology, no acknowledgement of how long he had been protected. Just a clean break. A desperate attempt to distance themselves from the scandal. But the public? They weren't forgetting. And neither was Shaq. Matt sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled fists. His apartment lease had been terminated. His bank account was frozen while legal reviews took place. His name had become poison, blacklisted from every security firm, law enforcement branch, and private contractor in the state. He had gone from untouchable to unemployable in just 7 days. The worst part? He couldn't even fight it. The video footage, the records, the testimony, the entire city had turned against him. His entire career was over. And deep down, he knew. He had no one to blame but himself. While Matt's world crumbled, Shaq was building something bigger. Standing at the front of the Golden Plate, he addressed a crowd of reporters, microphones and cameras pointed at him. "This isn't just about what happened to me," Shaq said. "It's about the system that allowed it to happen in the first place." The cameras flashed. The city listened. Shaq took a deep breath. "I'm launching a new foundation, the Unity Initiative. It's going to provide legal aid to people who have been victims of racial profiling. It's going to fund investigative journalism. And it's going to hold people in power accountable." The crowd broke into applause. This wasn't just a response to what had happened. This was a declaration. Shaq wasn't just moving past this. He was changing the game entirely. In the back of the restaurant, Sloan sat in stunned silence. She had spent the past week exposing corruption, breaking a story that shook the city. She hadn't expected anything in return, but Shaq had other plans. He slid an envelope across the table. "Open it." Sloan hesitated, then carefully peeled it open. Her eyes widened. A full-ride scholarship to one of the top journalism schools in the country. "This is for you," Shaq said. "For your future. For the stories you haven't told yet." Sloan swallowed hard, blinking back tears. This is too much," she whispered. Shaq shook his head. "Nah, it's exactly what you deserve." For the first time in her life, Sloan was speechless. And for the first time, her future felt limitless. The restaurant had never been busier. People came from all over, not just for the food, but for what it represented. It had become a landmark, a symbol of survival, a place where change had begun. Shaq looked around, watching customers fill every table, the energy in the room buzzing with hope. Jackson clapped a hand on his shoulder. "You did it, man." Shaq smiled. "Number we did." Because this wasn't the end of the fight. It was just the beginning. The city had changed. Not overnight, not all at once. But little by little, like the slow shifting of the tides, things were different now. The Golden Plate still stood in its rightful place, thriving. The name on the window had not faded. If anything, it shined brighter than ever. But something new had been added. A mural. Towering over the restaurant's outer wall, painted in bold strokes of blues, golds, and deep reds, it captured a single moment in time. Shaq, standing tall, handing a bill to the homeless man outside his restaurant. But the artist had done something subtle, something powerful. The way the light hit the painting, the way the shadows blended in, it looked like Shaq wasn't just giving the man money. It looked like he was lifting him up. Shaq stood in front of the mural, hands in his pockets, staring up at the image. Even after all these years, the memory was still sharp in his mind. The weight of that moment, the tension, the unspoken truth that things could have gone very differently. Pretty powerful, huh? Shaq turned at the voice behind him. A young police officer stood a few feet away, not approaching aggressively, not demanding anything. Just standing there, looking at the mural with something that wasn't judgment, wasn't hostility, just understanding. Shaq studied him for a moment. Young, maybe mid-20s. The next generation. "You knew the guy who painted this?" the officer asked, nodding toward the mural. Shaq smirked. "Yeah. He was a kid when all this happened. Said it changed the way he saw the world." The officer nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. Then he took a deep breath. "I wanted to say something," he said, shifting slightly. "Something I think you need to hear." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." The officer exhaled. I joined the force because of what happened here. Shaq's eyes narrowed slightly, not with suspicion, but with curiosity. The officer looked down for a second, as if choosing his words carefully, then lifted his gaze again. I saw that video, the one with Officer Reynolds. I was just a teenager, but I remember the way it made me feel. Angry, confused. I kept thinking, how does that happen? How does someone with a badge, with that much power, treat someone like that? He swallowed. And then I saw how you handled it. How you didn't let it break you. How you turned it into something bigger. That stuck with me. Shaq didn't speak. He just let the officer keep going. When I went into the academy, people like Reynolds, they were still there. Not as many, but enough. Enough to make me realize how important it was to be different, to be better. The officer hesitated, then took a step forward. I wanted to tell you this in person, not online, not through a comment section. I wanted you to know that what you did, it mattered. He extended a hand. Shaq looked at it. Then he clasped it in his own. A firm shake, an unspoken understanding. The officer left a few minutes later, disappearing into the hum of the city. Shaq turned back to the mural, staring at the painted version of himself. Some fights never truly ended. Some battles had to be fought over and over again. But this was proof that change had begun, and it wasn't stopping anytime soon. Some stories fade. This one can't. Injustice thrives in silence, but change begins when we refuse to look away. This isn't just about one moment. It's about every moment like it. What happens next? That's up to us. Stay aware. Stay loud. Stay in the fight.